If you go to Google Maps and you type in London, it'll take you probably right where you expect. But if you type in the city of London, it'll zoom into this much smaller area right here. London has a lot of unique neighborhoods, but this one is different. This is essentially a city within a city.
And if the King of England goes to the City of London, he can't enter unless he has the permission of the Lord Mayor. And that's been the case since William the Conqueror.
Even though the City of London has its own police force and mayor, you could walk through it without really realizing that it's separate from London at all.
If you do know what you're looking for, you can see that the street furniture changes. It goes to that red and white colour scheme. You have these dragon statues. They mark the edge of the jurisdiction of the City of London.
The reason for this separate City of London is rooted in the very founding of the city itself. And by looking at just a few elements of early London, we can really start to understand the layout of this city. If I make it the entire time here without getting hit by a car, it's probably a miracle. This is a place that's declared themselves the center of the world and was the capital of the largest empire in human history.
I recognise you from Instagram. I love your feed.
Oh, thank you.
To try to understand this city, I went to London and met up with Jack Cheshire.
My colleagues will be very jealous.
In addition to running a blog and Instagram called Living London History, he also gives tours of the city and has recently released an awesome book all about the small little details that you might miss when you visit.
I generally talk about, the more the quirkier sites in London.
I was also introduced to Reg. I'm Daniel.
Oh, right. Yeah, Reg, yeah.
A man with great amounts of knowledge, energy, and strong British attitude.
The map for the International Exhibition held in London in 1862.
He knows a ton about London, and he spent a while talking to me about it, but not before explaining to me that it was the British, not the French, that created the guillotine. Apparently.
So there's the blade, and there's the person who's going to be beheaded, and that was in 1210, long before the French think they've invented it. They never did, yeah.
With how big it is and all of its history, London can be pretty overwhelming. But if we just zoom into the City of London, it's actually perfect because this was the city for most of its existence.
The City of London today is really the financial district.
Before we had the British Empire, London itself was a colony of a different empire, the Roman Empire.
And there have been a few sort of scattered Celtic tribes around the area, but no sort of proper urban settlement. So really the Romans founded London. But this is where the Romans established the city as Londinium.
Much of the reason for London's placement and geography has to do with the natural landscape that was here originally. And you can see a lot of that in the streets still.
London is here because of the River Thames. Of course, that links us to the continent really and is an artery of trade and commerce and a link to the outside world. The reason that it's here specifically is probably because this is the first fordable point. So the Romans built the first bridge across the river.
About 100 years after deciding on the placement of this colony, the Romans built a wall around its perimeter that is still very influential on the City of London. Not only is this wall still evident in some of the street names, like the street London Wall, but there are portions of this wall that are still standing in the middle of modern-day London.
We're stood next to a section of the old Roman city wall. It had 5 gates in it initially, 7 gates in the medieval city. They added a couple.
And the names of these original gates are still names that are used in the city.
Obviously, it's a defensive measure, building a wall. No one necessarily knows who they were specifically trying to defend against. Celtic tribes and uprisings possibly coming into London. London being completely burnt to the ground in 61 AD by Boudicca. But also, as I say, you had those gates in the wall. Everyone had to come in through the gates. They could control who was coming in and out of the city. They could collect tolls from people. So, as is often the case with London, it comes down to money.
This wall became the border of the city for hundreds of years, even way long after the Roman Empire had fallen.
It really defined the shape of London for about 1,500 years.
And when you look a little closer at the natural landscape that the Romans were working with, it becomes really revealing about the layout of the modern city.
The history and geography of the city is all kind of tied in together.
St. Paul's Cathedral, which is right here, is still one of the major anchor points in modern-day London. And you'll notice that it's within this Roman wall, and there's a reason for that.
The original Roman city was over two hills, Cornhill in the east, Ludgate Hill in the west here. And St. Paul's Cathedral, when it was originally built in the 7th century, was built on that second hill. On the other hill, on Cornhill, was where the Roman Forum and Basilica was. So you get these points in London that have always had some sort of significance, whether it's where a temple was, a church was, a cathedral was, but also a spot of power or a point relating to ceremony like the amphitheatre.
One of the major reasons the Romans decided to settle on the north side of the river is because the south side was super marshy and not very good for building on. So these two hills are a major reason that the city is right here. In addition to these two hills, there were also two rivers. One was the River Fleet, which was just west of the city, and the other was the Walbrook River, which ran between these two hills through the center of the city. And these are actually still visible, but you kind of have to look for them.
From the original Roman city, the original Roman gift shop. So we're coming down from St. Paul's Cathedral, which is built on Ludgate Hill, and we're walking down essentially into the river valley of the River Fleet.
Farringdon Street today is right here and follows the path of the River Fleet.
Farringdon Street and Farringdon Road is where the River Fleet once was. So you can see it starts to go up again on the other side. I mean, it's not very pronounced today because they built Ludgate Circus up and sort of levelled it off over the years, but you also still get these little clues. So just up behind me here, up the street, is a little road called Turn Again Lane, because you'd have once walked down that little street, you'd have come face to face with the River Fleet. There wasn't a crossing there, so you wouldn't have been able to get across, so you'd have had to have turned again and found another route. And it's still called Turn Again Lane today, even though the River Fleet, is no longer visible.
The wall is probably the biggest influence on the city today that the Romans made, but there are some other things. One of them is actually right here, and on the map, this is a visible remnant of an old Roman wharf called Queenhithe. The original Roman wharves were made of wood, and one of the original pieces of wood is actually outside of an entrance of a church that Jack and I go into in a bit. One of the most compelling things about this Roman Londinium is that it actually sat abandoned for nearly 400 years. For a bunch of reasons, the Roman Empire was contracting and the military was pulled out of this area and they just left the city behind. Okay, I owe you guys a massive, massive thank you. Not only for subscribing to this channel and getting it past 100,000 subscribers, which is so huge for me. Thank you. And if you're not subscribed, the button's right down there. You're welcome to subscribe. But what makes me so proud is that this is a community that's interested in understanding the world in more than just a surface level way. So I'm incredibly grateful for today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a tool I've been using that helps me understand the news and where it's coming from a lot better. They pull from over 50,000 sources and then provide you with tools to help you understand how different outlets cover different stories. One of the best ways you can support me and this channel is to use the link at the top of the description to sign up for Ground News, which is ground.news/Daniel Steiner. Every story comes with a visual breakdown of the bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of the reporting outlets, all backed by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, this year, there's a painting from the 1500s that was found at a bus stop in London that is now going up for auction for over £25 million. When I came across this article, I could immediately see what was being reported from the left, the center, and the right. And with each of them, I could see who owns it, how factual it is, and what their bias is. If I click across these, I can see the different headlines, which often can vary a lot depending on the bias of the source. One of my favorite features of Ground News is their blind spot tool. What it does is shows you which articles and news reporting is not happening on the other side of the political spectrum. And they do this for roughly 20 stories every day. Go to ground.news/Daniel Steiner to get 40% off their Vantage plan, which is the plan that I use to get unlimited access to all of their features. Huge thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video, and thank you so much for watching this and for being a part of this community that wants to understand the world and understand each other a little bit better. Let's get back to the video about the map of London. After the Roman London, we start to enter the era of medieval London. There were Anglo-Saxons who, rather than occupying this same space that was already built, they built a new settlement just right next door. Modern-day Covent Garden was the heart of this Saxon settlement that was neighboring Londinium, and it became known as Londonwick,
which basically meant London port or London trading town.
And this would become a key part of London today. To connect these two settlements, a main road was established that still exists today, actually as two roads. This portion here is the Strand, and this portion here is Fleet Street.
So for many years, the Strand really was the only road that linked up these two quite distinct places for most of London's history. And its name comes from the fact that it follows the bend of the Thames, the beach of the Thames, and it comes from the Old English word for beach, essentially. So all of these streets coming off the Strand down to the riverside, I mean, you can see they slope down. That's essentially the old riverbank of the Thames.
At the meeting point of these two streets is where Temple Bar Gateway is. Temple Bar is essentially a gate or a bar across the road that divided these two different settlements.
The column is where the Temple Bar Gateway once was and straddled the roadway there. So it pretty much marks the point where Fleet Street becomes the Strand, where the City of London becomes the City of Westminster.
While the Romans and Saxons did settle this land, it's not like they just walked in and plopped down. Invasions from Vikings led to these Anglo-Saxons reoccupying Londinium and building on and refortifying the then decaying Roman wall. It was a couple hundred years later when William the Conqueror invaded England and took charge.
He wanted to sort of intimidate the people of London, I suppose, and show them that someone new was in charge. So he had the White Tower in the Tower of London built, which is the keep in the centre with the four kind of onion domes on top there that you can see. So that's actually the oldest building in London, kind of complete building. Basically saying to the people of the City of London, I'm not going to interfere too much with what you're doing as long as you remain on my side. So he went around the rest of the country conquering it largely by military force, but when it came to the City of London specifically, he took on this slightly more diplomatic approach, I suppose, whether you can call it diplomatic, building a great big castle in the corner of the city, I don't know. But also, of course, it's right on the riverside as well, so he could then monitor ships coming into the city via the river, because it's downriver from London Bridge.
And speaking of London Bridge, it was during this time that it became much more than just a bridge. In 1987, David T. Agate, a passionate man armed with a lot of cardboard boxes, created a model of the medieval London Bridge that is still on display in a church right here. And Jack took me to see it.
You can see this amazing model of the old London Bridge, one of the wonders of the medieval world, here from the early 1200s until the early 1800s. And it was lined with buildings and shops on either side, sometimes up to 6 stories high, and then the roadway running between the two. So it could get very, very congested, as you can see by all the little figures. You can see they used to display the heads of executed traitors, represented by these little matchsticks on the model. You couldn't really avoid body parts coming into the old City of London. It was built by the City of London, and they could charge people to live on there. There's still a foundation, I suppose, today that has loads of money, historic money, from the tolls paid and rents paid from the bridges, and they use that to build Tower Bridge, Southwark Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge is one of theirs as well.
In the 1830s, when the Industrial Revolution was just picking up steam, the population of London skyrocketed, and this led to a ton of congestion and need for new infrastructure. So this narrow bridge with its many arches became restrictive not only for people coming in and out of the city, but also for people going up and down the river. So it was dismantled, and a new bridge just west of where that one was built in its place. The structure of London Bridge itself was replaced many times, but today this is still the London Bridge. When you look at how the roads line up, it's actually very clear where this bridge went. The church where this model is, Church of St. Magnus the Martyr, and its placement today seems kind of odd because it's kind of cut off from the city by these busy roads. But when you consider the old position of the bridge, it makes a lot more sense. The entryway of this church was actually the archway that entered the city onto Fish Street Hill on the north side.
We're on Fish Street Hill here, which was more or less the first road in Roman London. So it links down to London Bridge, down to the south here, over the river, and of course on to Dover and to the continent. And then up here it led to the Roman Forum, the Roman Basilica. So this was the axis of Roman London, if you like.
Do you remember who King Henry VIII is? He's the one that, killed his wives. Turns out his last name is not the Eighth, it's Tudor. And the period that followed the medieval period of London was called the Tudor Period. This is when his family ruled England. The city really began to expand a lot more. During the medieval period, this area over here where Parliament is and Westminster is, was developing. There had long been a church there, Westminster Abbey, that had been kind of the political center of the city. But during King Henry VIII's reign, he really made significant changes to the Palace of Westminster and solidified this area as being the political center of not just London, but England. The city really began to expand west of the Roman center and south across the River Thames. It was at the very tail end of this era when a little thing called the British Empire came about. With London being in this spot on the river that could handle incoming ships, and with now a whole empire bringing things back from all over the world, the shipping industry and the docks really got built out in London. You can still see right here St. Catherine's Dock, which is just east of the Tower of London. One element of this was the creation of the East India Company, where a bunch of ships were going back and forth between England and India. And actually the word loot is a Hindi word that was used in the English language. Not only were they taking resources, but they were enslaving people and using London as a hub in the slave trade. This is a period of time that I can't really imagine anyone wanting to live in. The population was going up, the city was getting more dense, the slums were getting really bad and really extensive, the plague was going around and a lot of people were dying, and that all kind of led up to one day in 1666 when the city accidentally hit the reset button. Actually, it wasn't the city, it was one person, one guy, a baker.
In the early hours of the morning on the 2nd of September 1666, he hadn't put out his fire properly. A spark flew out of the fire, presumably landed in a pile of fuel, burnt down his property and spread.
Over the course of 3 or 4 days, 4/5 of the medieval city was destroyed by fire. This map shows where that fire was, and you can even see how the Roman wall helped kind of contain it in places. But all of the structures in this area were really damaged by the fire, and this included St. Paul's Cathedral. Shockingly, only 6 people died in the fire, which I was expecting a much bigger number. But I think the reason for this is because when the fire started, the Lord Mayor really underestimated how devastating it could be and was slow to take any action.
So incredibly destructive, but very much a turning point in some ways in London's history. It was the birth of London as a modern city in many ways. So all those old timber and thatch buildings were of course burnt to the ground. And after the fire, they brought in various building regulations about what you could build your buildings out of: stone, brick. You weren't allowed to have any overhanging floors. There were height restrictions. So they brought a little bit more order to the city as well.
Basically, immediately after, the next year, a monument was created to remember the fire, which was creatively called the Monument.
It symbolically depicts the Great Fire of London and then the rebuilding of the city. Maybe this is bad timing. Great big rubbish truck. It's 202 feet high, which is roughly 61 metres. If you laid it down on its side, the top, the golden flaming urn at the top of the column, would land at the point that the Great Fire of London started. This little plaque in the middle of the road, this is where they've worked out that the Great Fire of London started.
It was built by this guy, Sir Christopher Wren, the most famous architect in England at the time. He had a lot of varied interests and wanted to try combining them.
There was like a laboratory in the bottom of the monument. They could open up hatches on the floors going up the column and you could look up through the holes and it would act as a telescope, but they didn't realise that the column would move a little bit. So it didn't actually work out as a telescope, but it was originally meant to have a dual purpose, and the flaming urn at the top was meant to hinge off so that you could open it up. But today you can climb up it.
But Christopher Wren had bigger plans than just a monument. He had drafted up an entire street layout proposal for the reconstruction of this area. You can see it has these wide, straight streets and plazas with this radial grid, just completely rewriting the vast majority of the roads. London doesn't look like this today because all of those who owned land were willing to stand by it, even though it was reduced to ash.
Londoners owned their little bit of freehold where their house used to be, now a burning pile of rubble, essentially, and they didn't want to give that up for this new plan.
The people who owned the land in the city said, "What? That road goes through the middle of my land." So they kept all of those courts and alleys.
Are you glad that it stayed that way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful, the city. Yeah. It would have been horrible, it would have been like New York. I was going to say Paris, but Paris is quite nice. Only because the French didn't ruin it.
But even though his street plan was shot down, Sir Christopher Wren still went on to design the modern version we have of St. Paul's Cathedral. Even though the old street pattern was kept, there was one street that was added, and it was this one here. This makes up Queen and King Street.
Linking the Guildhall up this end, which is the sort of city hall of the City of London, right down to the river, where now Southwark Bridge is today.
This historic city had to undergo a pretty massive transformation from the medieval city that it was to the modern London that we know.
The population of Victorian London exploded, basically, in the 19th century. It went from about 1 million in 1800 to about 6 million in 1900. So, an astronomical growth over the course of that century. And that brought with it many problems, namely space and sewage and transport.
A lot of this was because of the demand for labor during the Industrial Revolution.
But also empire, of course, as well. The Victorian city was at the heart of the world's biggest, richest empire. It was the largest city in the world in the 19th century, so everyone was coming in for, ideally, I suppose, those opportunities, but it was a very unequal society.
Between the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution and all of these goods flowing into the city, something happened called canal mania. The idea of getting manic over building canals is just awesome. And many of these canals are still cemented in the fabric of the city. Like this one you can see cutting all the way across up here. As the city grew, so did the economic divide. The east side of the city became a growing slum with horrible conditions, and the west side was actually a lot of farmland that had long been owned by aristocrats that was eventually turned into either parks like Hyde Park, which is just off the map here, or subdivided and sold to other wealthy people who could own land. And that's why this area of the map, you start to get a more regular street pattern that resembles something closer to a grid. It was also during this time that the River Fleet, which used to run right here, was covered by Farringdon Road. This is not only because it was becoming really polluted, but also because the land that would take its place was becoming more and more valuable. The city also really began to expand south with the construction of a bunch of new bridges, making the London Bridge far from the only one. Most notable of these is Tower Bridge right here. To me, Tower Bridge is one of the symbols of London. Even though it was built centuries after the Tower of London, it not only took its name, but also its architectural style. In addition to the bridges going over the river, though, London was also the first place in the world to build a tunnel under the river. This was known as the Thames Tunnel and ran right here. Originally, it was just for pedestrians to cross under the river on foot, but the way that it was created actually paved the way for the tube system to be built, which today actually runs through the Thames Tunnel.
From the early 19th century, we had trains coming in, as in overground trains. But then we got, later on in the century, 1860s, we got the tube lines. So it was really that, and particularly when we could dig the deep level tube system, they could bore down into the ground. And that allowed London to spread rapidly.
It was also during this era when we got the creation of Trafalgar Square right here. It sits at the end of the Strand and became the center point for London, where all distances are measured from. This really was an era when new engineering feats were transforming the city, one of which was the building of embankments along the River Thames. A huge project to build 3 different embankments made the river a little bit narrower. One of them was just off the map here, another is Albert Embankment right here, and finally Victoria Embankment right here.
So we're still on the Victoria Embankment here, where in the 1860s they reclaimed about 35 acres of land from the river to put these lovely gardens on top, to put a road on top, but also to put a main sewer running through there and the district and circle line. So improving transport, space and sewage for a rapidly growing population. So behind me you've got the York Watergate, this is called, so it dates from 1626 and it used to be the Watergate, the sort of back entrance to York House, which was a huge mansion, an aristocratic mansion. That was knocked down in the 1670s, but its Watergate was kept and this hasn't moved, so this is exactly where it would have been before the embankments were constructed. Now the Watergate is sort of stranded in the middle of the gardens, but you can imagine the water still today of the Thames lapping up against the bottom of the steps here.
But all of this serious development and growth came under attack during World War II. For 8 months, spanning between 1940 and 1941, Nazis dropped thousands upon thousands of bombs on the city. This became known as the Blitz, short for the German word Blitzkrieg. Hitler's goal was to destabilize the British economy and to impede their efforts in the war.
The Nazis were targeting the heart of trade. They were trying to take out the power of London. So it was largely the city of London and the East End that took the brunt of the bombing in the Blitz.
Intense bombing led thousands to shelter in the tube tunnels underground. During this period, over 40,000 people were killed in the city. One night in December of 1940, the attack was so brutal that it became known as the Second Great Fire of London. These bombings resulted in fires that burned twice the size of land that the Great Fire of London did in 1666. One of the areas that took the most damage during this bombing was the area directly around St. Paul's Cathedral, and it's a miracle that the cathedral even survived at all.
So much effort went into saving St. Paul's during the Blitz. A team of volunteers, clergy, firefighters worked around the clock. They were called the St. Paul's Watch. They slept in the crypt of the cathedral. They were based up on the dome to keep an eye out for incendiary bombs, put out fires, and save St. Paul's Cathedral from the bombs of the Blitz.
Do you have any memories of reconstruction after the war?
I remember playing in the bombed out houses.
Wow.
We had the best adventure playground in the world.
You don't see many bomb sites around London anymore. Of course, generally they've been built over, restored. This one has been left. It's been left as a memorial garden to the Blitz. Blitz bombs destroyed the Victorian warehouses that were on this site, but revealed the old Roman wall beneath. So in some ways, a bit of a silver lining of the Blitz, that it revealed these layers of archaeology.
One place you can go see this is in the church All Hallows by the Tower.
It's actually, in terms of its foundation date, said to be the oldest church in the city of London, when London Wick was still a thing.
It was heavily damaged during the Blitz, and beneath it, a bunch of the artifacts are stored in a free museum.
So we're going down into the crypt here, where they've got a little crypt museum. So we need to go around here. These are bits of Saxon stonework here. The old church door, which has been damaged during the Blitz. This would have been the floor of a Roman dwelling that was here before, obviously way before the church was here.
But you don't necessarily have to go to a museum to see this stuff. Just walking around the city, you might come across some remnants. It's easy to think that all of this is history, that World War II was a long time ago, that now we've discovered everything about ancient Londinium. But the truth is, there's always more to the story. I think this is evident when you look at the archaeology that's been done even in the last 50 years in London.
So this is one of my favourite things down here. I mean, it's not an ancient artefact, but it's a model of Roman London. It was made in the 1920s, but it's missing one crucial part. It's missing the Roman amphitheatre, because they didn't know where that was by this point. That was only discovered during the rebuilding after the Blitz in the 1980s over by the Guildhall. So it should be in the top left corner up here.
And today there's a marking on the ground outside the Guildhall, so you can see where that amphitheatre would have been. And this is just one example. The foundation of the original Shakespeare Globe was discovered just the year before, in 1989. In the 1960s and 1980s, it was discovered that these paintings were actually done on the back of the oldest map we have of London. Then, as recent as 2013, a mass burial ground was discovered from victims of the plague. And in 2016, 400 ancient writings from Roman London were discovered.
I think I've fallen more in love with London the more I found out about it, if that makes sense. Like the more you can tie together these stories or see that, you know, this is where a lost river used to be. And it's almost a journey of the imagination, and it's a living place. It's not a museum, you know, it's not a perfectly preserved place, but that's what I think makes it so interesting and so fascinating.
Huge thank you to Reggie and Jack. Jack was incredibly helpful and spent a long time walking around with me. If you liked anything in this video, you're gonna love his book. So I've put the link in the description below, and you should pick yourself up a copy. If you wanna support me and this channel, don't forget to check out the link in the description for Ground News. You can hit that subscribe button if you haven't, and like this video. I also have a Patreon that's linked in the description. So if you're interested in supporting me there, I'll see you over there. But thank you so much for watching this, and I'll catch y'all in another video very soon. Peace.